Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is Sarah Zenaida Gould, Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. And tonight we have a MACRI talk for you, Inventing Latinos, the Origins and Impact of a Latino Collective Identity. We're joined tonight by Dr. Laura Gómez. She's the author of the book, Inventing Latinos, A New Story of American Racism. Before we get into it, I want to invite any of our viewers to let us know where you're tuning in from. And of course, if you have any questions for our guests, you can put those in the chat and we will try to answer all the questions. Okay, so let me tell you about Dr. Gómez. Welcome, Dr. Gómez. Dr. Gómez is professor of law at the University of New Mexico. She is a nationally recognized expert on anti-Latino racism, law and society, Latinx people and the law, critical race theory, and the sociology of race and racism. She has published widely on these topics in academic forums and the popular press, and gives frequent media interviews. Her most recent book, Inventing Latinos, A New Story of American Racism, appeared on NPR's Best Books of the Year list and has been called pioneering and rigorous and provocative. She's a New Mexico native. She has a bachelor's degree in social studies from Harvard and a master's in sociology from Stanford and a PhD in sociology and law degree from Stanford. Wow. Welcome, Dr. Gómez. Please, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for having me today, and thank you to the MACRI staff for getting me here. We scheduled this months ago, and I appreciate the follow through, and I appreciate all of you in the audience, whether you're streaming with us today or watching this retrospectively. So I am going to talk to you about my book, Inventing Latinos, A New Story of American Racism. This book was published in 2020 during the pandemic, and then as a paperback book in 2022 with a new afterword. Before I turn to the book, I want to introduce myself briefly, and thank you for that introduction that you gave me. I will pick out a few different themes, but some related. So as Sarah said, I'm a scholar based in a university for 32 years. I've been a law professor, 22 of those years at UCLA, and the remaining 10 at the University of New Mexico. I was born in Roswell, New Mexico, in the southeastern part of the state known as Little Texas. And that is not meant as a compliment, but rather as a statement about the depth of the anti-Mexican racism there. Racism more akin to that found in Texas than in northern New Mexico. My mother's parents were born in Texas and migrated to Roswell in the late 1930s. And my paternal grandfather was born in Chihuahua, Mexico, while my paternal grandmother's New Mexico roots go back some 10 generations that we have documented. I left Roswell when I was 2 years old, when my father started college at UNM in Albuquerque, where I grew up until I went to Harvard for college and Stanford for my degrees in sociology and law. And I moved back to Albuquerque from Los Angeles 3 years ago. I'm very happy to be back here. Although I love Los Angeles, I'm happy to be back home. Inventing Latinos is meant to be an inviting book for everyday people, as well as students and scholars. I try to avoid academic jargon and an overly theoretical orientation to make it accessible. And the book is available from your local independent bookstore or on Amazon. So when talking about a book, one always faces the choice of breadth versus depth. Because I can't do both in a 35-minute talk, today I'm going to go with breadth. So I'm going to give you an overview of the 4 chapters of the book. And this means we won't get into a lot of details, but you'll get a sense of the entire project, and hopefully you'll want to buy the book. So the 4 chapters are entitled as follows. Chapter 1, We Are Here Because You Were There. Chapter 2, Idealized Mestizaje, Anti-Black Racism and Anti-Indian Racism. Chapter 3, The Elusive Quest for Whiteness. And Chapter 4, To Count We Must Be Counted. So I'll start with Chapter 1, In the first chapter, I survey the long history of American empire in North and South America, focusing on U.S. intervention in Mexico, Central America, and the Spanish Caribbean. We must understand imperialism and immigration as part of the same continuum, as kind of happening along that same line. Even though U.S. intervention in Latin America took many different forms, it was all imperialism, whether it was outright military occupation in the service of manifest destiny, such as it was in Mexico for sure, and even parts of Central America, or whether it was for the purpose of extracting resources like coffee, sugar, or bananas, as in Puerto Rico, Cuba, Guatemala, Honduras, and Costa Rica, or for the purpose of connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, as it was in Panama and Nicaragua, or whether it was to provide access to an exploitable labor force, as it was, of course, in all of those places, Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. All of these were U.S. imperialism, and the variations are myriad, but they're all species of imperialism. In chapter 1, I discuss 2 centuries of American imperialism in the Caribbean, Mexico, and Central America. And today, 96% of all Latinos in the United States trace their ancestry to those regions of Latin America, whether as immigrants or the descendants of immigrants. The intensity and cumulative nature of U.S. imperialism in Central America is staggering, and it continues to account for today's exodus of refugees from the region. Because our time is short, I just want to give you one example today, one country-specific example, and that's Guatemala. So American imperialism there began with a multinational corporation called the United Fruit Company. It was so closely linked to the U.S. government that its lawyer and board members moved back and forth between the corporate board and cabinet positions such as Secretary of State. United Fruit Company entered Guatemala in 1899, buying up the best land in the country for banana plantations. Twice, it successfully enlisted the U.S. Navy to force the Guatemalan government's hand. And finally, when the pro-unionization, pro-land reform leader was elected by the Guatemalan people in the 1940s, the U.S. staged a coup. This U.S. action set off a 35-year civil war and a cycle of state-sponsored violence that persists today. It has included the murder of 200,000 civilians by military and police trained at the infamous School of the Americas in Panama, run by the United States. And more than 80% of those people who have been murdered have been indigenous Maya people. The genocide and economic displacement caused by Americans is why so many Guatemalans are today making the treacherous migration north. So imperialism and immigration are part of the same continuum. So we shouldn't be surprised that Central Americans today make up 10% of all Latinos in the United States. Okay, so let me move on to chapter 2, idealized mestizaje and anti-Black and anti-Indian racism among Latinos. So let's shift gears to the 17% of Latinos who trace their family origins to the Spanish Caribbean. 10% of those Latinos are Puerto Rican, 4% of those are Cuban, and 3% of them are Dominican. Focusing on the Caribbean puts into sharp relief the legacy of an even earlier colonialism than the U.S. imperialism in Central America, that by Spain. Spain encountered 80 million indigenous people in the so-called New World, but only 10 of those 80 million, 10 million of those 80 million survived Spanish contact, Spanish genocide, and Spanish enslavement. In part because of the labor shortage Spain's own genocide created in the Americas, the Spanish colonizers imported 12 million African slaves to the Americas. Across Latin America, the Spanish promoted a system of white supremacy. But the Spanish version of white supremacy, unlike that of the English colonizers, which we inherited in the United States, did not include banning marriage between African, indigenous, and Spanish peoples. Instead, tremendous mestizaje, or racial mixture, was the result. The Mexican census of 1646 showed, for example, equal numbers of Blacks and Spaniards. Most of the Spaniards were not actually from Spain at that point. They were criollos born in the in New Spain at the time. But alongside those equal numbers of Blacks and Spaniards, that 1646 census showed 10 times as many indigenous persons and Indo-Hispanic mestizos. So the result was a mestizo population over time. And along with mestizaje came colorism, a preference for lighter skin, and racism, specifically anti-Black and anti-Indian racism in the Spanish colonies, and then later anti-Black and anti-Indian racism among Latinos in the United States. One effect is that Caribbean Latinos living in the United States today tend to underestimate their African ancestry to a degree that is confusing for others who see them as Black. For example, more Dominicans than any other Latino subgroup identify as Black on the US Census, but that is still only 8% of Dominicans and only 6% of Puerto Ricans in the US, on the island of Puerto Rico as well as on the mainland. Instead, the majority of Puerto Rican and Dominican Latinos on the US Census choose to identify as other race when asked their race. And we'll return to this theme when I get to chapter 4. The point of chapter 2 in the book is to urge us to face our own internalized racism that consistently favors those with lighter skin, those with greater phenotypical and cultural proximity to Spain as the original colonizer. And I'm happy to take any questions about that later. So now I will turn to chapter 3, the elusive quest for whiteness. Chapter 3 focuses on Mexican Americans. Almost 70% of all Latinos in the US are of Mexican origin, and 8 out of 10 Mexican Americans are US citizens, much higher than all subgroups except for Cuban Americans, who, as you may know, came as refugees and received all the benefits that entails, benefits that Mexican immigrants have not had. Of course, there's also Puerto Ricans who aren't immigrants at all, right? So other than Puerto Ricans and Cuban Americans, Mexican Americans of all the Latino subgroups have the highest rate of US citizenship. Mexican Americans in the early 20th century emerged as a buffer group between whites above them and Blacks below them in the American racial hierarchy. And in short, via some legal and political maneuvers, Mexican Americans in the 19th and 20th centuries sought to shore up their whiteness and distance themselves from Blackness in the United States. So one example has to do with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which in 1848 ended the US occupation of Mexico and resulted in Mexico ceding half of its territory to the US. And I include in that Texas, right? Because the boundary between Mexico and Texas wasn't settled until the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So that same treaty collectively naturalized the 115,000 Mexicans who were living in the ceded territory at a time when US law allowed only whites to become naturalized American citizens. And that law had been in place since 1790 and remained in place until after the Civil War, when it was amended to allow whites and those of African descent to naturalize. And here I'm just gonna point out that if you take that population, so you take all of the Mexican cession, right, which includes all or parts of 11 states, including all the states along the border with Mexico today, but including others as well who don't have a current border. Nevada, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah. So if you take all of those states, there were 115,000 non-tribalized Indians, Mexicans living in that region. And 2/3 of that population was living in present-day New Mexico, not in Texas and California, where today, in Arizona, where today we think there are way more Mexican Americans, but in New Mexico. And that was partly because of the very deeply settled Pueblo indigenous community still present in New Mexico today, who lived along the Rio Grande in what is present-day New Mexico. Okay, so let me get back to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And despite that treaty, which said that the former Mexican citizens living in the United States had American citizenship if they wanted it, various U.S. states, in particular along the border, disenfranchised many Mexican Americans as too Black or too Indian. And this included Texas and California in particular, less so New Mexico, but definitely Texas and California. So Mexicans in this environment, right, from the beginning of the Mexican American community in 1848, had to essentially continually relitigate their whiteness to be able to vote, to be able to run for office, so forth. One such case occurred in 1907 in a naturalization case where Judge Thomas Sheldon MACRI, a federal judge in San Antonio, Texas, had to decide whether one Mr. Rodriguez was white enough for naturalization purposes. So I talked about the collective grant of naturalization under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Now I'm talking about a particular case in 1907, right? So several decades later, half a century later, where this judge is deciding in San Antonio of 1907, is this person white, this new immigrant to the United States, not someone who was living here when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was decided, is he white enough to become a naturalized citizen? Because, well, here I'll read you what Judge MACRI said as he visually inspected Rodriguez. He said, quote, if the strict scientific classification of the anthropologist should be adopted, Rodriguez would probably not be classified as white. And it is certain he is not African or a person of African descent. Now, he had to say that later phrase because remember that I said after Reconstruction and the Civil War, that naturalization law of 1790 was changed to also allow Black people to become naturalized citizens. But the idea was that you had to be white or Black, right? Not indigenous. So the judge eventually concluded that even though Mr. Rodriguez was an Indian in appearance, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo meant that he was white for naturalization purposes. In large part, he was influenced by the political economy of Mexican immigration in San Antonio in 1907. In fact, he ordered briefs to help him decide this question, which he said was one of delicacy and gravity. And the whites who submitted these briefs were split on the case. On the one side, there were briefs that complained that there were too many Mexican Americans voting in San Antonio. And this was in 1907, right? On the other side, agribusiness wrote in their brief that they desperately needed Mexican laborers, so they supported granting citizenship. Ultimately, Judge MACRI decided that Rodriguez was white enough, even though he conceded he wasn't actually white. But just 10 years later, the issue became largely moot because Congress enacted the first guest worker program for agricultural workers from Mexico. And since 1917, we have continuously had a temporary worker program, the most infamous of which, of course, was the Bracero program of the 1940s, 50s, and early 60s. The message that these temporary worker programs, which many people are predicting we're going to need in the future because we are deporting people, was that you can come to the United States to work, but not to vote or not to be part of the community. 7 years after that first temporary worker program, the 1924 immigration law entrenched a deliberate strategy for the next 4 decades to make the U.S. look racially and ethnically like it did in 1890. So this is the 1924 immigration law, but it's pegged to the 1890 census before the massive influx of Eastern and Southern European immigrants who were seen as lower status than the northern immigrants. But it was after we'd already excluded all of the workers from Asia, right, through the Chinese Exclusion Act and a series of other laws, the Asiatic Barred Zone and other legislation. And now with this 1924 law, we were excluding workers from Mexico and further south by entrenching the number of immigrants, by pegging the number of immigrants to what the number of people from those countries was in the US in 1890, even though this was 1924. So in this social and legal climate, early Mexican American organizations like LULAC, which was founded in 1921 in Corpus Christi, made the choice to emphasize their Americanness, to adopt an assimilationist ideology. They embarked on what many scholars call the other white legal strategy, sort of like, well, we're white until proven otherwise. But in reality, Mexican Americans were saying with this strategy, we aren't Black, so don't treat us like you treat Blacks, right? But the other white strategy began to break down after World War II, when discrimination against returning veterans was blatant and relentless, especially in places like Texas. But it didn't totally break down until the 1960s and 1970s with the Chicano movement and the Boricua movement, both of them based on the Black civil rights movement. And those movements articulated a desire to be named and counted as people of color, not as white. Okay, let me take a sip. So I want to turn now to chapter 4, To Count, We Must Be Counted. And I'm going to talk about 2 key census moments involving Latinos before turning to some of the 2020 census data. So the first moment is 1930 to 1940, looking at the 1930 census and the 1940 census. The 1930 census was the only census in US history to include the word Mexican as a racial category option, not as a national origin option, but as a racial category option. And the purpose of inclusion of that category in 1930 was precisely for the purpose of deporting Mexicans during the Depression. Now, we have also seen at another historical moment the use of census data, the 1940 census data, to round up Japanese Americans and Japanese nationals for concentration camps during World War II. And we may be on the verge of seeing a similar dynamic today, right? Where maybe we're going to start seeing that kind of barrier that the census is supposed to have, that none of that information is disclosed to other branches of the government. Just like we thought that there was a barrier for the IRS, which now is no longer true under this administration. But we may be on the verge of seeing a similar dynamic today. So as the 1930s progressed, there were so many Mexicans and Mexican Americans, American citizens of Mexican origin, who were deported, that Mexican American organizations and leaders fought to have Mexican removed from the census as a racial category by the time the 1940 census came around. Okay, so that's moment number 1. Census moment number 2 is looking at the 1970 census and the 1980 census, so 30 and 40 years later. So by 1970, the glaring absence of a national count of Latinos or any specific subgroup like Mexican American was becoming apparent. So there was a new organization on the scene, MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, on whose board of directors I sit, was brand new, and it sued the federal government, alleging an undercount of Mexican Americans in the 1970s, in the 1970 census. Although that lawsuit was dismissed, it had the effect of lighting a fire in the federal bureaucracy and in Congress, and it led to the formation of a Hispanic Advisory Committee, and finally in 1980, a census question counting Latinos in the United States for the first time. So for the first time that all Latino groups, not just Mexican Americans, were counted, because that Mexicans were counted in 1930, right? But this was all Latinos for the first time in 1980 counted. But Latinos were not added to the race question like Asian Americans were in that same year, 1980. Instead, the census added a separate, quote unquote, Hispanic ethnicity question. So since 1980, up through the 20 census, we all have to answer these two separate questions, right? Leading many Latinos to be confused and sometimes quite upset. One question says, are you Latino or Hispanic? And if you answer yes, you are asked to give a more specific subgroup response, such as Mexican American or Central American, Cuban American. And then you have to answer a second question that says, what is your race? With the proviso that Latinos can be of any race, right? So that's the two census question format that I want to talk some more, really unpack now. Okay, so let's now turn to the 2020 census, and I'm going to talk about two things. One, I'm going to talk about three wrong-headed moves that Trump 1.0 made regarding the 2020 census and how crisis was averted. And then number two, I'm going to talk about the results of that 2020 census and what we have learned from that data. Okay, so what are the three things that the Trump administration did wrong leading up to the 2020 census? The first thing is that the Trump administration rejected the Census Bureau's painstakingly researched recommendation to, instead of having those two separate questions, the Latino ethnicity question and the race question, to combine them into one question. So this research was conducted between 2012, basically under the second Obama administration, right up until close to 2018. And by painstaking research, what I mean is they did all kinds of regional studies, okay, all kinds of partial studies, like, okay, let's do a 5% sample of the US population here to see how they're going to respond. Let's look at how Latinos will respond and look at how they will respond from all subgroups, etc. Very careful research. And based on all that research over the period of about 6 years, the Census Bureau recommended, instead of having those two questions, let's just have one question, and Latino will be an option on the race question. And they found that that did not depress the numbers of Latinos who were choosing Latino ethnicity. What it did depress was the number of Latinos who were choosing other race, right? I'll come back to that in a moment. So Trump becomes president and in 2016, and he decides, or I guess in 2017, because he got elected in 2016, and he says, we're not going to do that. We're going to go back to the old method, right? So the second thing that he did vis-a-vis Latinos is he tried to add a citizenship question to the 2020 census, which would have been the first time there was such a question since 1950. However, the Supreme Court, in an opinion written by Chief Justice John Roberts, refused to allow the change due to an administrative law technicality. However, so even though that citizenship question was not added, there had already been months and months of conversation about the proposal in the press, on social media, which led some Latinos and probably others to skip the census that year. The third thing that the Trump administration did is, after the census data for 2020 was collected, Trump directed the Census Bureau to exclude undocumented persons from the overall counts. The Census Bureau administrators refused, saying that this was a blatant violation of the Constitution, which requires not a count of citizens, not a count of voters, not a count of adults, but a count of all persons in the United States for reapportionment processes every 10 years. So Trump tried to do these three things, which I contend all were directed toward Latinos. He was stymied in two of the three, but all of them were, I think, a sign of his animus toward Latinos. Now, what is it that we see, turning to the results of the 2020 census? What is it that we see in terms of the racialization of the nation's 62 million Latinos? And what I contend is that there are three big changes that show that Latinos' racial identification, racial identity, racial formation has changed dramatically, and changed dramatically between the 2010 census and the 2020 census. Okay, so three big changes. Number one, there was a 53% decrease in the number of what I call census white Latinos from the 2010 to the 2020 census. So these census white Latinos who select the white racial box don't really see themselves as white. In fact, one study that used the same two-question format as the census but asked additional questions bears this out. And this is a study by a sociologist named Nick Vargas. So they were asked, okay, what race are you? And then, are you Latino or not? And then they were asked, well, what race do other people see you at? And of those census white Latinos in this study, only 2% of the people who checked that census white box also said that others saw them as white, right? So the moral of the story is that people who check white on the race box are not actually saying that they are white and that other people see them as white. It's about something else, kind of a defensive whiteness. But what's interesting with the 2020 results compared to 2010, it's a dramatic difference. So in 2010, about half of all Latinos checked that white box, right? They were Latino and they were white, about half. And this has actually been gradually going down since 1980. But in 2020, it was only 1/4 of all Latinos in the nation who checked that census white box. The second big change in the 2020 data is that there was a huge increase in the group of Latinos who chose some other race, right? Who rejected, oh, I'm white, oh, I'm Black, oh, I'm Indigenous, oh, I'm Asian, no, or some even who instead chose other, right? And this actually had the effect. So if you go back and you look at the 2020 race data, you'll see, oh, the largest race in the United States is white people. The second largest race in the United States is other. And 98% of those who chose other in 2020 were Latino. This number increased from the high 30s to 42% of all Latinos, a shift that was the shift between 2010 and 2020. So some of those census white Latinos that I talked to in the first trend are now identifying themselves as other race. And the third change in 2020 is an increase in the number of Latinos who identified with one or more race. Since the 2000 census, right, not 1980, not 1990, but from 2000 forward, Americans have been able to say, oh, I identify with multiple racial groups. But in 2010, only 3 million Latinos identified as multiracial, checked more than one census race box. But in 2020, that number went from 3 million up to 20 million, and was 1/3 of all Latinos. So combined together, these 2020 results suggest that the vast majority of Latinos have left behind the dream of becoming white, or pretending to be white in America. What happened between 2010, the census in 2010, and the census in 2020 that prompted this movement? One dynamic that happened is the Black Lives Matter social movement, and especially the summer of 2020 protests over the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. These mass protests around the country and even around the world occurred while the 2020 census was being conducted. So I have no doubt that they influenced the results. The second thing I call the Trump effect. So beginning in July 2015, when he walked down the escalator at Trump Tower to launch his first campaign for president, Trump spewed anti-Mexican and anti-Latino hatred throughout the campaign and even as president, such as when he called El Salvador a quote-unquote shithole country, along with Haiti and all countries on the African continent. Trump fomented anti-Latino hatred and racial violence, none clearer than when a young white man, Patrick Crusius, drove 12 hours from Dallas to El Paso to, as he put it, slaughter invading Hispanics at an El Paso Walmart in August 2019. Unlike the Charleston massacre at First AME Church or the Pittsburgh Synagogue massacre, Crusius was not put on trial. In the federal charges, he pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty, and he was sentenced to 90 consecutive life sentences, and so he avoided trial. And on the state charges, he pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty, and so there's been no trial, and his sentencing will be later this month in El Paso. And I close today by asking, what is it that we, Chicanos and all Americans, lost by foregoing a trial of Patrick Crusius? And what I think we lost is the chance to put on exhibit the racist hatred against Latinos in the United States, and really the chance to put Trump on trial, because Crusius and his attorney both said it was Trump's words that motivated him to kill that day. And instead, many Americans still refuse to believe there is anti-Latino racism, still attributing anti-Latino violence to xenophobia, for example. In closing, we must watch out for the Trump administration's retooling of the 2030 census, which I think what he's going to try to do is achieve the twin goals of decreasing participation by Latinos in the census because of fear, and also trying to play games with reapportionment in order to give fewer congressional seats to Latino-rich states and more seats to those states with small Latino populations. So there's more to come on this subject. Thank you.
Oh, wow. You've given us so much to think through. Okay, I'm going to try to organize some thoughts here. One, I'll put this in the chat, but I just wanted to share out loud. If you are in San Antonio and for some reason you're at the Alamo, right across the street from the Alamo is an old federal courthouse / post office, and it's where Judge MACRI made that decision. And a couple of years ago, they finally put up a historical marker there about N. Ray Rodriguez. So if you're in San Antonio, I encourage you to go see that historical marker, know that something really important happened there. And I'm not talking about the Battle of the Alamo. Yes, but something happened there, yes. Oh my goodness. You know, the issues with the census in particular as something that's so critically important, so important that the founding fathers understood that this census needed to happen. And yet it has been over the years this political thing. As you mentioned, it's been used not just to figure out apportionments of resources, but also in some cases to target people, whether we're talking about the forced repatriation of people of Mexican descent, including US citizens during the Great Depression, or the systematic rounding up of Japanese Americans for forced imprisonment during World War II. And you mentioned the thing with the IRS. I know this just happened, and if you haven't been paying attention to the news, or if you've just been overwhelmed with the news, you may not have caught this. Could you explain more about what just happened with the IRS?
Yeah, so as I understand it, the IRS commissioner who just resigned, I think yesterday, but on Friday, uh, released or released the information that the IRS had agreed to give the what are those numbers called? It's the IRS number. If you don't have a social security number, you can still
file your tax,
a tax ID number, to other government agencies, Homeland Security, of immigrants whom they are investigating for criminal violations. Now, that's kind of the detail that I think is going to be the rub here, right? Because they're saying, okay, we're only going to give it to them if they're conducting a criminal investigation. But we know that Homeland Security has the line that anyone who has crossed without papers into the U.S. is violating the law, the criminal law, even though historically and officially that's a civil violation, not a criminal violation, right? So we just don't know how broad this loophole is going to be. But I think it could potentially be very devastating. And it's so ironic, right? Because people come here, they come here without undocumentation sometimes, and they work and they pay taxes, and they pay a very significant portion of local, state, and federal taxes. And now we're going to turn that against them. To possibly be used in deportation.
And I think it's very scary, because for years the IRS was telling people, pay your taxes, and we're not INS. Pay your taxes, so you stay on the good side of the IRS. Pay your taxes, and so people would apply to get this tax ID number, and they were paying taxes every year. And now, yeah, so that's very scary. I also, I'm sorry. I don't want to forget, there was an audience question about, you mentioned a number of people of Mexican origin, people living in the ceded territory following the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. You said 115,000. So there was just some curiosity about where that number would have come from.
Yeah, the number that I use comes from a sociological study, and I am afraid that I do not remember the author of the study from one of my earlier books. But what they do to get that kind of a number is they have to go back and look at a bunch of data sources, and then kind of it's almost like going back forensically and kind of extrapolating backward. Okay, if we had this population in this year, what would that population have been then and that forth? So it's an estimate, but it is a pretty, it was a very careful study, as much as we could know what that number would be. And I think even if we don't necessarily, let's say it's 100,000, or let's say it's 85,000, or it's 125,000, it's somewhere in that range. I think the part that is very interesting is that 2/3 of that number was in present day New Mexico. The remaining 1/3 was divided between California and Texas. And again, the point that I was making was the Mexican government and the government of New Spain, right, which Mexico was called at the time, they saw New Mexico as the place to settle because there were these pre-existing Pueblo settlements along the Rio Grande. And so if you go and you look at the New Spain settlements of mestizos from Mexico who came to New Mexico in the 1600s and in the 1700s, they would often be right next to a pueblo, right? And you still see that today, right? So if you have been in New Mexico and you drive between Albuquerque and Santa Fe, there's like several pueblos, and next to each pueblo there was a Mexican New Spain settlement, right? And they learned from each other, and they were able to survive with the Apache Indians and the Comanche Indians and the Navajo Indians, who were much more hostile toward the Mexican government or the New Spain settlers, right? So that was how they were surviving, but you didn't have that same setup in California or in Texas. You didn't have the depth of those agricultural settlements. You had much more control by what anthropologists used to call the nomadic Indian tribes.
So there's another question from the audience about the movement by some people to, and by that I mean Latinos, to mark themselves as indigenous on the census. And so the question is, what are your thoughts about identifying yourself as indigenous in the census?
Yeah, and one of the great things is, like I said, since the 2000 census, you can mark as many of those groups as you want to mark. AOC says, "Oh yeah, I'm Latina, I'm indigenous, I'm African American." I don't know what she checks on the census. I'm not saying I know that, but she says I'm part of all these groups, right? And I know personally, if I'm filling out a form that doesn't have other race as an option, it only has white or black, I will sometimes choose indigenous just because I don't want to say that I'm white, because I don't believe that I have lived my life as a white person, even though I have all kinds of privilege more than people who are phenotypically darker and so forth. But what's interesting to me is that the numbers of Latinos who do choose indigenous are very small. I think it's about 1.5% of all Latinos nationwide. And part of that is because if you look at what it says on the census question, if you choose indigenous, the next question it asks you is what tribe? And most of us don't have a tribal membership. That was part of the ravages of colonization, is that we lost our tribal identities over generations. And I think for Black Latinos, I think it's in the neighborhood of 3%, if I'm remembering. So they're not high numbers, but those numbers did not change when they did the studies of the combined question. Those numbers did not go down. The number who chose Latino race and Black, Latino race and indigenous, but they're not as high. I do agree with the question, which is that it is increasing over time, but it's still a small proportion. And part of that might be because, for example, Central American and Southern Mexican indigenous immigrants aren't going to necessarily see themselves as American Indian, which the question says, are you American Indian? It's like a different dynamic of, are you a tribally enrolled member,
right?
US versus indigenous,
right?
By custom,
right? And it's just so interesting. I know other folks have spent a lot of time looking at, for example, indigenous populations from Mexico who have resettled in parts of New York City, and how in many cases those folks don't even, like, Spanish isn't even their first language.
Correct.
Right? It's some indigenous language, and yet our census, which is, I want to say, to be fair, a work in progress maybe, but I don't know that there's really an accurate way to even explain that in the census.
The Mexican census, the Census of Mexico, has since, I believe, 2000, it could be 2010, but I think it's since 2000, has increased its questions related to language use as a way of getting at that. Because so many Mexicans are, part indigenous, mestizos, right? That they've gotten at it by asking language. But we haven't done that in this country. We haven't used language in that way. Although you used to see the terminology Spanish-speaking people, which was a bit of a misnomer, right? Because people could be multi-generation, not speak Spanish, but still be Latino, right?
Right.
But that would be one way to get at that, I suppose, if we had that kind of question.
Yeah. And that actually foreshadows something I wanted to mention before we get off the air tonight. And that's that we do have our annual symposium coming up at the end of May, and several of the things that you have brought up tonight are going to be revisited in that. One, we have joining us at the symposium Robert Santos, the first Latino, and he's Mexican American, but the first Latino to head the U.S. Census. He'll be joining us on day 2 of the symposium to talk about, why it's so important that we get counted and what is the future of us being counted. And then we also have Vilma Martinez and Tom Syons joining us. Vilma Martinez was the first woman to lead MALDEF. Tom is the current leader of MALDEF, but they'll be talking about the 50th anniversary of the 1975 Voting Rights Act, which was an expansion of a 65 Voting Rights Act to incorporate what they called language minorities, whether or not we are Spanish fluent or not. Yes, but so they'll be coming too, and so
sounds like a great symposium.
I hope it will be, and it will be live streaming, but it will also be here in person in San Antonio. So registration will open up in a couple of weeks. If you don't subscribe to our newsletter yet, please subscribe, and you'll get the alert when registration opens for that. But I do think, as we're thinking about challenges to how we're being counted and also how we're being seen and how we're being, I love that you ended with this question about, is the anti-Latino sentiment being hidden from us in a way that is potentially, kind of working to make us think that maybe we're no longer a target when in fact we are. I mean, what we saw happen in El Paso was just shocking, and shocking, devastating. But when we're not having these open conversations about that, it's hard for us to address what is being kept silent. So that's something for us to think about, and how can we, and to the person in the audience, yes, the symposium will also be virtual, so we'll be live streaming that for you. In terms of the future of Latino, I will just say, I feel like the last few years, some people got very opinionated about things like Latinx, Latine, and then there was even a little bit of, anti-Latinidad, that no, we don't want to all be grouped together. We want to be recognized for being Puerto Rican, for being, wherever you're from, wherever your family is from. And I just wonder, Latino is still so new. Do you think it's going to be with us for a long time, or is it more of something that is going to be phased out with something else?
I think that's an interesting question. Since I work with people who are much younger than I am, I see what, they're changing ideas and changing terminology more than, say, people like me I'm 60, I have my ideas, right? But young people are constantly kind of coming up with this new terminology, and I had a very strong negative reaction to Latinx originally, but now I've come much more softened toward it, because the students tell me they feel included. If they are queer or trans, they feel much more included with that terminology, or with Latine, So I try to use a variety of terms. I don't really, I'm not as particular about it as some people, like some of the politicians who say, oh, I don't want to be called Latinx, right? Which I can respect that as well. I think that, it's interesting, because I have, in some ways, this book that I've been talking about tonight, Inventing Latinos, is a sequel to a book that I published in 2007 called Manifest Destinies, The Making of the Mexican American Race. And when I wrote Manifest Destinies in 2007, I said, very much, we have to tell these separate stories. This is the story of Mexican Americans and the origins of this group. Someone else needs to tell the story of Puerto Ricans and so forth, right? But then by the time I published Inventing Latinos in 2020, I had actually shifted my own thinking about this to say, I am seeing something different in this country, which is the demonization of Latinos as a group that's racialized. But a large part of why that is because almost 70% of Latinos are Mexican origin, right? And undocumented people, and the sort of notion of illegals as a racial trope or racist trope. And so I've shifted my own thinking to an extent about that. And I think that whether it's Hispanic or Latino, we're going to continue to see that that kind of conglomeration of groups, even as we see very important differences within that category. So I suspect that it's here to stay for some significant period of time. And one of the dynamics that I think, and I know we're winding up, but one of the dynamics that I think is interesting right now is if you have watched some of the Venezuelans in Florida who have basically, they said, oh, I supported Trump, but I didn't think he was going to do this. I didn't think he was going to come after us, right? Like this notion that they thought that they were protected, which sometimes you also hear this with Cuban Americans too. Well, they're not going to be racist against me because I'm Cuban. But the truth is, because Mexican Americans are the tail wagging the dog, they are, that there's a kind of a larger group that gets tainted. And when you talk about Crucius and at the Walmart in El Paso, he didn't ask for people's IDs. He shot about the same number of American citizens of Mexican background because he was in El Paso. They were of Mexican background as Mexican nationals. And he didn't care. He said he was offended by the fact that they were speaking Spanish and they looked a certain way. So.
Wow. I do want to thank you, Dr. Gómez. Your research is just fascinating. And I know we're going to be learning more about, what's going to happen with the next census as we go along here. We'll see. They have to start planning that out pretty early. I mean, so it's going to be interesting to see what happens next. I just want to thank everybody who joined us tonight for this conversation. And I also, of course, want to thank all of our funders. MACRI's programs are funded in part by the City of San Antonio Department of Arts and Culture, Bexar County, the Mellon Foundation, the John L. Santikos Charitable Foundation Fund of the San Antonio Area Foundation, Spurs Give, and individual donors like you. Gracias. If you liked tonight's presentation, we have lots more events coming up. I do want to say next Friday is the closing of our current exhibit. So if you haven't been out to see it, I recommend coming and seeing us. We have Si Se Puede, student art inspired by Dolores Huerta, who turns 95 tomorrow, by the way. So this exhibit is up at the Visitor Center here through next Friday. And lots more things coming down the pipeline. You can always find our complete calendar of events at our website, somosmacri.org. We really need your support. Things are getting a little weird for organizations like ours, but we're going to stick around as long as we can. So please subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on social media, and come to our programs. We appreciate it. Gracias and good night, everyone.